Hi, welcome to the Canadian City and Southern Railroad. Today's video is texturing the scenery. The rasping is now done, and it's time to vacuum up the mess with the shop vac, and then put the final level of detail into the foam with the X-Acto knife. Well, the final carving with the X-Acto knife has all been done, and the little bit of refuse has been vacuumed up. All except for right in here. I have left this to do it now so that you can see just how quickly this moves, in case some of you were thinking that this would take forever. I'm doing this even on the more gentle slopes because when it comes time to put the grass and dirt down, it'll catch a little bit in some of these and give the illusion that underneath the soil there's still bedrock. Well, now the final step is to give all of this a really thorough vacuuming, and after being brushed with a sort of stiff plastic bristle brush, scrubbing brush. That's to knock off all the excess. So let's talk about texturing. Now what I have here is some regular old joint compound wall mud And I've mixed in my base color, which is raw sienna, which works for the area I'm modeling. And I simply put it on with a paintbrush. I put it on fairly thin. And then I've got some thinned raw sienna paint left over from what I mixed in with the plaster. I pre-mix it. And that thins it out and helps it get into all the nooks and crannies left over from the carving of the styrofoam. Now you'll notice that a lot of the fine detail that I carved into the foam disappears. That's all right. It'll come back in another step. You'll notice that I'm trying to work fairly quickly. Also, that I'm not just brushing sideways, I'm brushing up and down and sideways, and I'm also, especially where it's not getting into the little areas, stabbing. I found over the years that's pretty important. Otherwise you end up with some areas that you don't notice at first, and then later on, maybe when you're taking some video or up close to an area and uncoupling a car or something, that you've got little holes in your scenery. That might be blue or pink, depending on what kind of insulation foam you might be using. By the way, this step also works on spray foams. I don't use them because of the cost. And because I find that with the method I showed in the previous video, I can get a much more varied landform. This is a little tool that I make sometimes. I've got several, and when they wear out, I just make another one. What it is just some guitar strings with some holes drilled in a piece of scrap wood, and they're just a little ways apart. The idea is that I used to come back after this stage with the X-Acto knife and do that step over again now that the plaster is on here. Now it needs to be sort of dry, not entirely dry. This area I just did, still too wet. But over in here it's had a few hours to dry. And this will naturally follow the marks I made with the X-Acto when this was still just foam. It goes very quickly. And depending on the type of rock and how you look you want and the area you might be modeling, you could even skip this step, as some rocks are eroded more smoothly than others. And the stratified layers don't show as much. I find it nice though for sandstone, and also works very well for shale. Of course, for igneous or metamorphic rock, you would leave that out. If it turns out that these lines that I'm putting in are disappearing, that just means that the plaster is still a little wet, and come back in a minute or two or half hour or something and do it over. When the plaster is wet, you don't need to press too hard. If it gets a little dry, you may need to press a little harder. If the plaster layer, which is very thin, gets totally dry, then you can always come back with the X-Acto knife. Or simply use this tool and press a little harder. Now that the thin plaster paint coat has been carved and is thoroughly dry, it's time to do a final step of texturing. And I'm combining several steps that I've learned how to do over the years into more or less one step. First off, I'm going to give a light wash, and this is a very thin wash. Of the raw sienna base color I mixed with my original plaster and coat. I'm not going to cover everything because it's going to run down here in a minute. This is just to bring back a little bit of the color and to get it to where it shows color but isn't so dark that it looks painted on. Just a light squirt of straight wet water so that it doesn't dry out too quickly. And then I'm going to give it a coat of gray, and this is even a lighter color. And it's a combination of stone gray and slate gray from Woodland Scenics, with a little bit of burnt umber. If I was doing Eastern shale, I'd use raw umber. But for the west, I don't want to take away the warm color of the rock, so that's what I use, is the burnt umber. And all this is mixed with quite a bit of water. And like I say, it's a fairly thin wash. Sometimes I just kind of dab this on as opposed to brushing it so that I don't soften up and ruin my detail, and to get into little crevices better. This creates a shadow effect and kind of brings out the highlights in the texture. Shows off the carving. I'm going to put just a little bit more of the raw sienna color here to kind of help blend it in with the section that's already been done and is nearly dry. Now I'm going to add some light soil. And I'm going to do this very sparingly because the color was mixed in with the plaster originally. I don't need to use a whole lot of this material. I used to use a lot when I was using white plaster and then staining it later. But what this is, and I make this myself, it's the same joint compound, wall compound that I use to make the paint plaster coating for the rock and soil. And then I put it on a thin plastic sheet, garbage bag or kitchen bag, and let it dry and crush it up with a mortar and pestle into various grits. And this is the finest grit that I'm using. And it's practically a powder. And that was raw sienna, and then just a little bit less, I don't want to overdo it with this color, yellow ochre. Again, that's been mixed with plaster and crushed with a mortar and pestle. And I barely used a fingerful there. Now I used to get this wet and let it dry for 12 to 24 hours before I added grass. But I found out that if you're careful, you can just keep right on going. So I'm going to apply static tack. And you'll notice that I'm going horizontal, parallel with my rock strata. I would go at an angle if the rock strata was angled. And I'm going to go to the flat surfaces. I'm not going to cover all of the bare rock. I don't need to use too much of it. And then I'm going to add some thinned, just regular old white glue. Combines with the static material quite nicely to kind of fill in a bit. Now I haven't added any extra water to this. If you do, it gets simply too wet and then the static doesn't stick out. Now I'm ready to add the static grass. On a level surface, I would use this little device that came with the Woodland Scenic Static Grass Applicator. But since I'm into a cliffside, that's kind of hard to position and it gets in the way of the falling grass. So I've got a needle stuck in here and I'm going to simply attach the ground to that and then turn on the static grass applicator. Be sure you attach everything before you turn it on or you could get a mild shock. Also, if your elbow touches the layout when it's wet and this is on, you can get a shock then too. It won't hurt you bad, but it might startle you slightly. Also, don't touch where the wire goes into the applicator. I have a homemade static applicator that works well, but it's a little more cumbersome, so I bought this thing. I think it's a great device, except I wish the battery compartment was slightly larger because it doesn't go very well. Now I've turned it off. It doesn't go too well with the rechargeable batteries I like to use. Now this will dry overnight, but I still go ahead and add a few little bits of material. This is medium foam, and I'm just going to put a tiny little bit on some of the ledges and down some of the eroded areas where it would grow in nature because there's more water there. And you can kind of tell where plants would grow because you'll be able to see the static tack material as a little more white. And that lets you know where this stuff will stick. I'm finishing up very sparingly with blended turf. The final step is to spray everything very lightly with some spray tack. This will help hold everything that you've done so far in place, particularly the larger bushes and things. After that dries, all the excess will be vacuumed up with the shop vac. Well, everything's all dry now, and I've put some pine trees and some structures down, and it's all pretty much ready to go. There's a lot more detail to go. Roads, put the buildings on their permanent foundations, lighting, more trees, a lot of stuff like that. Walls, cribbing, a lot. Ballast. But the basics are done, and it's time to move on. So thanks for watching, and have a really great day. And I think I'll do a little switching now. Well, it would appear that I got the water tower a little bit too close to the track. Nothing's permanent yet.